When viewed with decades of hindsight, Jim Ross leaving WCW for the WWF in 1993 feels like an especially monumental move. Arguably the most legendary announcer in wrestling history being lost to a competitor reads as a seismic occurrence. And truthfully, it felt seismic then. Even as far back as the early 90s, Ross was revered as wrestling's preeminent broadcaster. But WCW, they didn't exactly know what they had, and a series of maneuverings in early 1993 led to Ross being removed from the commentary booth. These machinations ultimately sent good old JR spiraling into the waiting arms of the World Wrestling Federation. But before Ross made his official debut with the company, he landed one last parting shot on his ex-employer. Dating all the way back to 1974, Jim Ross had made his living in the pro wrestling industry. His experience broadcasting wrestling on college radio led to him getting a fill-in announcer gig at NWA Tri-State, later to be rebranded as Mid-South Wrestling. Ross's first full-time job with the territory was as a referee, which he did for 3 years. He also worked as a traveling assistant to promoter Leroy McGurk, who was blind. In addition to McGurk, Ross also sat under the learning tree of industry figures such as legendary grappler Ernie Ladd, revered broadcaster Gordon Solie, and ornery brawler turned master booker Cowboy Bill Watts. After a few years of officiating and serving as right-hand man, Ross transitioned into broadcasting full-time. After Watts gained control of what was renamed Mid-South, Ross became the lead announcer for the territory and was also appointed to the position of Vice President of Marketing, effectively becoming Watts' deputy. Mid-South was flying high by 1986 when it once more rebranded itself, this time as the Universal Wrestling Federation, Watts' attempt at building his own national powerhouse. However, an economic downturn in the region caused the bottom to drop out, and Watts decided to sell. With the help of Ross, Watts sold the UWF to Jim Crockett Jr. in 1987. Ross then soon became the lead voice for Crockett's events, broadcasting alongside the likes of Tony Schiavone, David Crockett, and Bob Caudle. In 1988, Crockett sold the financially imperiled territory to Ted Turner, marking the effective birth of World Championship Wrestling, where Ross stayed on as the lead voice. That wouldn't be his only job with the promotion, as Ross served on WCW's booking committee and also worked as vice president of broadcasting. But it was as a broadcaster, of course, that Ross ingrained himself with the public. For every year from 1988 through 1993, Ross was voted the best television announcer in the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Awards. He would go on to receive the honor 8 more times between 1998 and 2009, and his 14 awards are 9 more than the next closest honoree. His urgent narration, complete with deadpan humor, colorful descriptions, and well-harnessed enthusiasm, made an average match exciting, but elevated marquee bouts into the god tier. The finest moments of Sting, Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, Lex Luger, and others are soundtracked by JR's excitable Oklahoma drawl. Nobody has ever, or likely will ever, call a match the way that Jim Ross has. He's worn many brimmed hats in his career, with commentator understandably being the most prevalent. At one time, though, Ross had his eye on a more challenging position. In the spring of 1992, there was an opening for the role of Executive Vice President in WCW. Jim Herd had recently resigned from the position after 3 maligned years, while highly fervent successor K. Allen Frey only lasted several months in the position before quitting himself. Ross craved the challenge of the job, feeling that he could steer WCW's fortunes for the better. He even went to CNN Center to give his pitch in person. However, unbeknownst to him, there was already somebody in mind for the job. His friend and mentor, Watts. The hiring of Watts came as a monumental shock, mostly since it seemed to come so far from out of left field. Even Ross had no idea it was coming, and Watts was somebody that he was particularly close to. What also made it surprising was the fact that Watts had been out of the business for 5 years, so it's not like he was a hot name on the tip of everybody's tongue. However, he had a great track record for success in running Mid-South, as his television was lauded for its grit, believability, and action. Watts was also charged with slashing costs, as WCW had been a money loser under Turner's ownership. Not one to be intimidated or squeamish, Watts seemed to have the right amount of cold stoicism to make those money-saving cuts where deemed necessary. Between creative flair and an alpha dog mentality, Watts seemed more than qualified to helm a national wrestling promotion, particularly one in desperate need of a rudder. However, there were complications. For one thing, the power structure didn't seem beneficial to Watts, who was used to being the unquestioned leader. Meltzer was quite prescient in his reporting of Watts' 1992 hiring, writing, "Watts was also always an autonomous leader, and now he'll be part of a corporate structure in a corporation which knows little about the nuances of the wrestling business." Ross came to the same conclusion after his first meeting with Watts post-hiring. When Watts told him, "I'm going to do it my way no matter the cost," Ross quietly and correctly predicted that Watts wasn't going to be long for WCW. Watts' school of thought versus multi-layered bureaucracy was a match made in hell, and since Cowboy is about as submissive as the gunslingers he admired, this arrangement was not destined to last. But it wasn't just the suits that Watts was likely to rankle. The locker room was filled with wrestlers that were about to have their fill of the Cowboy way pretty quickly. This was apparent when Watts instituted some pretty outdated edicts, banning top rope moves, barring faces and heels from traveling together, and not allowing anyone to leave the building until the final match ended, among many others. Plus, there was the whole pushing his novice son as a rising star thing, which didn't endear himself well to anyone, really. Watts was insistent on bringing wrestling back to some bygone period in order to turn business around, but his ideas felt rather primitive. Not only had Watts not been involved in wrestling in 5 years, some were wondering if he'd even watched any wrestling during that time. Nonetheless, Watts would have his day running the wrestling side of things. And Jim Ross was handpicked to be part of his executive committee, along with Dusty Rhodes, Jim Barnett, Tony Schiavone, and a few others. Before long, Watts ran into executive resistance in the form of TBS higher-up Bill Shaw, whom Ross likened to an evil Andy of Mayberry from The Andy Griffith Show. According to Ross, Shaw looked down on the wrestling part of the Turner Empire, viewing it as low class and low rent. Between Shaw and fellow Turner executive Bob Dew, Watts didn't have quite the autonomy he was expecting in WCW. And with Watts making enemies in Turner's company, this didn't really bode well for Jim Ross. Ross was closely associated with Watts due to both their years-long connection and present working relationship. JR was part of Watts' administration, officially as Vice President of Broadcasting, and the more people that Watts alienated, the more some of the heat would fall on Ross. By February of 1993, the walls were closing in on Watts. Shaw and Dew was said to be taking a more hands-on approach in overseeing WCW, and restructured the company into 3 divisions: pay-per-view, television, and wrestling, with Watts heading the latter. The way the hierarchy was staggered, Shaw sat at the top as WCW president, with several other people answering to him. One of them was Dew, to whom Watts would personally answer. Not that Watts would be with WCW for much longer. On February 10th, Watts resigned from WCW. While such a move was likely, given his diminishing power, the resignation coincided with increased awareness of a controversial interview that Watts gave in 1991, in which he made several questionable remarks about discrimination. That interview ended up being seen by baseball home run king Hank Aaron, an Atlanta institution who also served on Turner Broadcasting's board of directors. While it would have been difficult for Watts to remain on board under these circumstances, he claims to have resigned due to difficulties working under Shaw. And as for Ross, he still had his office job, but his days as a WCW broadcaster were coming to an end. In mid-February, Ross was removed from all television with immediate effect. He was pulled from that month's Super Brawl pay-per-view and replaced on all programs that he called. Ross figured this was guilt by association with Watts, later writing, "The guy that taught me more than anybody in wrestling was the guy who inadvertently derailed my WCW career." The man who effectively replaced Watts was Eric Bischoff. Contrary to Watts and other showrunners before him, Bischoff wasn't some dogged wrestling vet calling the shots, but someone willing to be more flexible in navigating the narrow strait between building a viable wrestling entity and appeasing the disconnected suits. For some time, Ross blamed Bischoff for getting him removed from television, but later came to admit that it was his ego and personal feelings that put him at odds with Eazy-E. In his memoirs, Bischoff claims that it was Shaw that removed Ross from the wrestling side of things. Bischoff remembers there being a contentious vibe from Ross, dating back even before Bischoff got the executive VP job, saying, "I didn't like working for Jim Ross at the time. He was a miserable human being. A lot of that had to do with the fact that he reported to Bill Watts and had to take a lot of Watts'. It was a miserable position to be in." While Ross and Bischoff are on good terms now, 1993 was a bit of a different story, and Ross was understandably unhappy with having his favourite part of the job taken away from him. Going forward, there was no spot for JR on camera in a changing WCW. There was, however, a spot for him off camera. Amid the flurry of changes, Ross met with Shaw at his office. There, Ross remembers Shaw giving him a choice. He could either take 6 weeks off to let any residual heat from his ties to Watts fade away, or he could accept a reassignment. Said reassignment would be a position in syndication sales, going around the country to market WCW's television to local affiliates. Ross could also work behind the scenes, producing the announcers. Ross was gonna be paid no matter what choice he picked, but he was too driven to just sit at home doing nothing. He also reasoned that if he went home for any length of time, it might look like he was showing solidarity with the sullied Watts. Somewhat begrudgingly, he took the off-camera roles. It didn't take long for Jim Ross to grow miserable in his new position, as he called the work soul-destroying. His passion was in broadcasting, and after brilliantly serving his employer in that role for more than 5 years, he felt he was just being stashed away until his contract expired. With his frustration beyond breaking point, Ross handed in his resignation on February 25th. Subsequently, he reached out to old friend Bruce Pritchard and the WWF. On Tuesday, March 9th, Ross made the 2-hour drive from Atlanta to Augusta, the site of a marathon taping of WWF Wrestling Challenge. There, Ross met with Vince McMahon, who queried him about his prior work across various booking and broadcasting departments. The Federation boss picked JR's brain about what could be done to improve the WWF product. As Ross describes it, he and McMahon amiably chatted for almost 3 hours, which is quite crazy when you remember that this was a busy show day for Vince. After that one meeting, protracted as it was, Ross says that McMahon offered him a deal on the spot, plus a signing bonus. He also informed Ross that his first day on the job would come at WrestleMania 9 in Las Vegas, less than 4 weeks away. However, there was a hang-up. Ross's WCW resignation triggered a 6-month period of severance payout, which would bar him from working for a competing wrestling company during the time frame. He was willing to waive the severance in exchange for the freedom to immediately sign with the WWF, which reportedly only Shaw and Do had the authorization to grant. Ross reached out to Shaw to seek his contractual release. According to Bischoff, Shaw came to him and asked what to do, if he should deny the request and prevent Ross from going to the WWF. And Bischoff claims that he gave the blessing to let Ross out of the deal, saying that there was really no point in stashing him away if he was just going to be miserable. When exactly Ross had the liberty to sign with the WWF isn't quite clear, but as most people close to the situation seem to understand it, Ross was still tethered to WCW as of Sunday, March 28th, 7 days out from WrestleMania. And what happened on March 28th is quite interesting. See, even if he was effectively silenced on WCW programming, Jim Ross still had one other outlet to make his voice heard. Since 1991, Ross had his own Sunday night wrestling-oriented radio show, Wrestling with Jim Ross, on Atlanta station WSB. This was no minor league station either. WSB was the radio home to every major Atlanta sports franchise, as well as Georgia Bulldogs college football and basketball coverage. It's also had affiliations at different times with NBC, Fox, and ABC News, so it's no small operation by any means. From its premiere, Wrestling with Jim Ross was in large part oriented toward WCW, since that's where Ross worked. WCW apparently sponsored the show to some degree, which makes sense, though Ross probably wouldn't have needed too much incentive to put the company over. He was doing that already as an announcer after all. However, something was apparently misunderstood about the radio show, at least on WCW's end. According to Ross, some of the bigwigs in the company were under the assumption that WCW owned the show. Ross claims that he himself owned it and personally set up sponsorship deals for the program. Thus, he was at liberty to dress up the show with discussion of any other promotion if he so desired. You know, like the WWF. And so, on March 28, 1993, a scant week before WrestleMania 9, Ross welcomed Vince McMahon, Bobby Heenan, and reigning Intercontinental Champion Shawn Michaels onto his Atlanta-based WCW-sponsored radio show for what amounted to just a massive WrestleMania 9 infomercial. It was on this broadcast that McMahon gleefully announced that Ross had signed with the WWF, saying that Christmas had come early, and calling it the equivalent of John Madden jumping from CBS to NBC. Vince McMahon appearing on a Southern broadcast while sticking it to a wrestling competitor? Where have we heard this before? It wasn't exactly Black Sunday, since there weren't too many hoops to jump through in order to make the appearance happen. Ross simply had McMahon on as an invited guest, and that was that. When Turner officials got word that McMahon was going to be on, they took exception, only for Ross to apparently stop them dead in their tracks by revealing to them the ownership arrangement of the program. As it appeared, he had the say, not them. There seemed to be some controversy regarding McMahon's declaration that Ross was on board with the WWF, since there was no word that Ross had gotten his full release from WCW. However, as Ross later claimed, WCW inadvertently voided his contract when they reassigned him from broadcasting to the sales job. If McMahon was willing to appear on the radio and declare that Ross was signed, sealed, and delivered, then the WWF side seemed pretty confident in making that argument. Indeed, Ross was at WrestleMania 9, as advertised. We all remember the moment best for JR trying to appear upbeat while wearing a toga, but less known is the story of the weeks and months that led Jim Ross into Las Vegas on that Sunday. The quarter century that followed in WWF, WWE wasn't always a bed of roses for Ross. The occasional humiliation angle and/or demotion, as well as the often thankless job he had to do working in talent relations, didn't make every day at the office especially cheery. But Ross did get to shine once more in the medium he was meant to work in, broadcasting. For a while anyway. Just as his voice is synonymous with cherished UWF and early Turner-era WCW moments, Ross provided the calls for the triumphs and tribulations of the Harts and Michaels, Austins and Rocks, Undertakers and Foleys, and Cenas and Lesnars. One of the strongest and most reliable voices outside of WWE, Ross came to cement a standing as WWE's greatest announcer ever. It's hard to imagine some of WWE's most legendary moments without JR's earnestly volcanic narration, but wrestling could have turned out much differently if a previous employer wasn't so dead set on taking him off the headset. But once WCW brass was content to put Jim Ross on the bench, he and his new boss found a creative way to stomp a mud hole in the old boss and walk it dry all the way to New York.